Welcome, Red Ice members. This is our part 2 with Frank Albo, and in our first part we talked, of course, about Freemasonry and his book, The Hermetic Code. Now, in this second part here, we are going to focus on the Manitoba Legislative Building in Canada. This was we invited Frank to discuss, but there were just so much interesting things to talk with Frank about regarding Freemasonry and architecture, so we kind of got stuck there a little bit in the first segment. But I'm really looking forward here to dive into the meat, as it were, of some of Frank's research. So it's nice to have you back again with us, Frank. And what I want to obviously begin talking about here is the background on the building itself. I mean, I guess the best place is to begin to talk about maybe the architect himself who designed the building and when it was built.
Well, this already launches the mystery of the complex of the building. We, in fact, do not know who is principally responsible for the design. I have a pretty good hunch of who it is probably, although there are three potential candidates. The first is the person who was awarded the commission in 1913, and his name was Frank Worthington Simon. He was a British architect. He was trained at a very prestigious school of architecture in Paris, and he circulated with the leading architectural firms in Edinburgh and Liverpool at the turn of the 20th century. He was given this commission and selected by the president of a very prestigious Institute of Architecture called the Royal Institute of British Architects, and he was selected among almost 70 other applicants that came throughout the Commonwealth. So it was a very large commission. It is the most expensive legislative building in the country. It went almost 5 times over its initial budget. It cost about $10 million, although its current replacement value is at about approximately $1 billion. He was awarded the contract and, on paper, was the principal architect of the legislative building. However, what we also have are some other interesting characters that weave throughout this narrative. One is the provincial architect who was an avid Freemason. His name was Victor Horwood, and he was appointed by the government in power at the time as the provincial architect, and he had submitted drawings of how he imagined the building would be, which appear very similar to the current manifestation. So there's good speculation that he also might have had a hand in it. And there's also, aside in consort with all of this, an enormous building scandal. For instance, most Manitobans who are familiar with the history of the legislative building are probably familiar with two basic facts. One is that the Golden Boy, this blazoned image of Hermes, yes, or Mercury on the dome of the building, was a gift from France, sort of like the Statue of Liberty of Canada or something like that. This is not true. And the other thing is that the building is mired in this large scandal where the government was found to have been responsible for misappropriation of over $1 million in public funding. Mm-hmm. And the entire administration at the time, a seemingly indomitable administration who'd been in power for 15 years, were forced to resign, and some even, in fact, the principal contractor of the building was in prison okay, for this scandal. So there are many, many different layers of this story. And then, of course, there's one other person who is a potential candidate, and his name is Septimus Warwick. And the reason that he is a potential candidate is because most of the European dictionaries of architecture that have commented upon the building's construction happen to mention him as being responsible for the drawings. And there is some indication that this is true. Now, having kind of painted out this very strange, probably convoluted story, I'm quite certain that the design and the intention behind the building was the work of Frank Worthington Simon, who was the principal architect.
But what we're potentially looking at here is some kind of collaboration, right?
Yes. In a project of this size, you always have collaboration. that there is there are craftsmen that are independently.
You're breaking up a little bit. Let's see if
Okay, hold on one sec.
yes.
How's that?
That sounds better. Yeah, please go ahead, continue, and we'll see if it holds.
Okay. Yeah, you have many contributors on a building of this size. The person who executes the drawings, the principal architect, and also the patrons sometimes have their hand in certain things. And then you have people that adorn the building, just the statues and commissions of that nature. These usually fall under the hand of the principal architect, who is the person I mentioned earlier.
Yes. So one thing that comes to mind here is if this building was intended then to be a legal building from the start, and if so, what is the relationship between law and Freemasonry?
That's a very good question. Now, how I want you to envision this building is on the surface, it has all the accoutrements and all of the design features that you would expect of a stately capital at the turn of the 20th century in North America. That is usually under the genre of neoclassicism. What that means is very familiar architecture that harkens back to the temples of Greece and Rome with Ionic columns and pediments and all of those forms. These usually were part of the landscape of architecture 100 years ago when designing courthouses, libraries, and government houses, because it gave the impression of noble democracy of the past or the fortitude of the ancient world. So, yeah, basically how I want you to envision the building and how I describe it to visitors that come and see the building is that on the surface it looks like a typical stately building that was done in neoclassical style. But that is kind of the cover story of the real intention behind the building, or at least the way I see it. Now, you had mentioned what on earth does Freemasonry and law and things of that nature have to do, or perhaps you want to rephrase your question because I think I lost it there.
Well, it's more, the idea was that if the building always was intended to be a legislative building, a legal building, so to speak, in that sense, and if so, what is the connection, if any, between law and Freemasonry? Okay,
right. Yes, I mean, the building has, the function of the building is certainly to enact law. And that is, of course, the daily function of the building. However, to me, the building as mere office space eludes the deeper impression behind the very complex design of the building. Now, how I want you to envision the building is as a kind of species of Masonic temple. And the reason I present it in this way is because the design, the construction, and the way you move from room to room is meant to reenact a process of enlightenment. And so, for instance, if you walk into the Manitoba Legislative Building, the first grand thing that you would encounter, that is in the interior, this is after having been introduced to this principal deity who is shown featured inside the central pediment, and underneath this central figure is inscribed beneath her feet Manitoba. And this is a kind of divinized version of Lady Manitoba, the kind of deity of the province. And surrounding her is an entire group of, and a scene that is meant to kind of allegorize this impression that everybody had of Winnipeg at the turn of the 20th century. And this is something that has since been lost. You see, Winnipeg was destined to be, or thought to be, the Chicago of the North, that it was the breadbasket of the world, because it was geographically centered in the near center of North America, and that it had the most sophisticated railway system in the world at the time for transportation in, North America. Then there was all this grand promise that Winnipeg and Manitoba, because of all of this grain and wheat that was in the province, that Winnipeg was destined to be this great place. So the early legislatures that if we were to envision a place that was to kind of act as a beacon for the province, for the promise of this great city and province, then perhaps what we should do is, use as the template the greatest building that was ever conceived. And that is, of course, King Solomon's Temple. Now, King Solomon's Temple in the Masonic tradition is not the description that you find in the very prosaic account in the Hebrew Bible.
Okay.
In the Hebrew Bible, there are two accounts where the Temple of Solomon is described in some detail. Now, Freemasonry picks up on this description, history, and legend of the building, and it becomes the template for a lodge. And not only a lodge, but the very design and shape, construction of the building is meant to offer salvation, not just salvation for man, but a kind of utopia for the future. So by designing as God designed his own temple many thousands of years ago, which was unfortunately destroyed, and recreating that in form, there is a way of, as I mentioned in the first segment, tapping in God's sacred power of creation. And so as you walk through the building, there is this kind of progression that you go through, which I'll describe after perhaps maybe dealing with your question.
So where the question is where do the Freemasonic lore come in here then? Because if the Bible has one account, if you will, of Solomon's Temple, where does the rest of the information comes from where Freemasons get their story and their version
Okay.
Okay.
Well, it's mostly invention. We have even today we have a pretty good general. The general consensus is that Solomon's Temple, at least what remains of it, was in the area of the present-day Dome of the Rock. And there are only remnants of the exterior citadel wall, one of which is one of the most sacred sites for Jewish people in Israel, which is the Wailing Wall. It's the last remnant of this citadel wall, and this is not that's just the wall that protects the inner part of the temple. The temple is still, we have no idea where it is. Some people suggest, and there's good reason to consider that the Dome of the Rock is possibly the location of what was the Holy of Holies of Solomon's Temple. And so temples were designed, and this is very important to understand, and once we understand this kind of basic typology of the temple, then we can look at this building and perhaps other buildings that are modeled on this through these eyes. And in the ancient world, temples designed in what's typically called a tripartite fashion. That means in three separate stages. And each of these stages represented basically progressions of sacrality or progressions of sacredness.
Do they represent the three first degrees in Freemasonry?
Well, you're very astute. Yes, in Masonic scholarship and Masonic speculation, these divisions of the temple correspond with the three grades of Masonic initiation.
Yeah.
Now, it's I'm laughing that you've mentioned that